I'm going to begin with some introductory presentations from myself, followed by Katie and Ellie, and then we're going to have a recorded presentation from Beth Rhodes, who's a young food ambassador. We're aiming for a comfort break at about 1:45 p.m. when we will put up a slide with some questions for reflection. And then when we come back from the comfort break, we're going to go into, I think, 2 breakout rooms with facilitated conversation based around the questions that are up on the slide or questions that you might want to ask yourselves in your breakout rooms. And then we'll come back together after about 20 minutes and have a close-in discussion and try and maybe work out some of, for ourselves, what the important considerations might be for future decision-making in Wales. Okay, that's it as far as the housekeeping is concerned. What I'd like to do now is very much very briefly cover some points about the right to food in international law, because this webinar is very much about the child's right to food. And you might think that when talking about the child's right to food that I would start by referring to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but that is not in fact where I'm going to start. I'm going to start with another human rights treaty, which is the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, a treaty which has attracted a good deal of attention in Wales of late. It's an international treaty to which the UK is a state party, and therefore the rights guaranteed in the International Covenant are guaranteed to everyone in the UK, irrespective of age, and government at all levels, so that includes the Welsh Government and local authorities, are under an obligation in international law to contribute to fulfilling the various rights which are set out in the Covenant itself. And amongst the rights that are set out in the Covenant is the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living. And that right is actually set out in Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And Article 11, the right to an adequate standard of living, expressly, so it's included in the article itself, expressly includes the right to adequate food. And later in the article, it's recognised that there is a fundamental right of everyone to be free from hunger, and that those requirements, the right to adequate food and the right of everyone to be free from hunger, requires action on the part of government to improve the methods of food production, its conservation and its distribution. So Article 11 of the International Covenant is quite clear. There is a right guaranteed to everyone to adequate food and to be free from hunger. The right to food is confirmed for the child by Article 27 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, although Article 27, as set out in the Convention, does not expressly refer to the right to adequate food using those words. Instead, the article refers to the right to an adequate standard of living, and it refers to the requirement on the state to assist parents, so the primary obligation is on parents, to provide for what's referred to as the conditions of living for a child's development. And it goes on, and this is where it becomes relevant, specifically relevant in relation to food. Article 27 goes on to require government programs to be introduced which provide material assistance and support for a child's nutrition. And that very much is the responsibility of government. So we can see Article 27 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child operating in this way. The primary responsibility to meet the food needs of their children belong to parents and carers, but the state is required to introduce programs which provide material assistance in order to enable parents and carers to do that. The importance of good nutrition as a right guaranteed to children is also emphasised in Article 24 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the right of the child to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health. And that article draws attention specifically to the responsibility of the state to combat disease and malnutrition through the provision of adequate and nutritious food. So it's quite clear that there is a right guaranteed to children under Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the right to adequate food, and under Article 27 and Article 24 in particular of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, to be provided with adequate and nutritious foods to support their development and to combat disease and to combat malnutrition. Okay, so one of the questions we might ask is, what do we actually mean by adequacy? Because that's a term that's used quite a lot in relation to the right to food. It's the right actually to adequate food and to nutritious food. Well, actually, there's not a great deal of assistance provided by the treaty framework to help us determine what adequacy might be. But we do get some idea from general comments which are published by treaty bodies such as the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and the Committee on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So for example, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has published general comment number 12, specifically on the right to adequate food. It was published in 1999, but is still very relevant today. And it emphasises, for example, the importance of accessible and sustainable food sources as an aspect of adequacy. It emphasises that food should be sufficient to meet dietary needs and to meet, in particular, the needs of disadvantaged groups. And it emphasises that adequacy includes not only nutritional food, but the adequacy of food supply. And food supply should be so arranged as to combat malnutrition. So that's a useful general comment, I think, from the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. As far as the Committee on the Rights of the Child is concerned, that committee hasn't published a general comment expressly on the right to adequate food, but several general comments from the Committee on the Rights of the Child deal with aspects of nutrition. So, for example, general comment number 4 on adolescent health and development, published in 2003, highlights the importance of good nutrition for adolescent health. General comment number 7 on rights in early childhood, published in 2005, again emphasises the importance of nutritious food for a child's early development. And general comment number 15 on the right to the highest attainable standard of health, published by the committee in 2013, and perhaps the most detailed when it comes to the right to adequate food, draws attention to the importance of measures being introduced to ensure access for all children to nutritional, safe and culturally appropriate food, and placing an obligation on government to ensure food security and access, and to promote the consumption of nutritious food. So if you like, that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of the rights framework when it comes to the child's right to adequate food in international law. I don't want to say anything more. That was really just introductory to know where we're all at when it comes to the right to adequate food in international law. What I want to do now is introduce our first speaker, who will be Katie Palmer. Katie, I hope you're ready. Katie is the founder and programme manager of Food Sense Wales, which is a charity hosted within the National Health Service that works with communities, organisations, policymakers and government to influence how food is produced and consumed in Wales. Food Sense Wales is a member of the Anti-Poverty Coalition and is currently working to influence how increasing eligibility for free school meals in Wales could also support the development of sustainable local food supply chains. Katie was one of a team of 4 who developed the School Holiday Enrichment Programme in 2015, a programme which now delivers food and fun to children during the summer holidays through a £4.85 million Welsh Government funded programme coordinated by the Wales Local Government Association across nearly every local authority in Wales. And she's also the director of Veg Power, a community interest company on a 10-year mission to turn around vegetable consumption in the UK. So that's Katie. Katie, if you're ready, over to you.
Thanks, Simon, and thank you for that introduction to the rights, because I have to say I find that really difficult to get my head around all of that. But I think, you know, basically what you were saying was that, you know, children and young people should have access to adequate food and housing, and good nourishment and nutrition are absolutely essential for children and young people to reach their full potential. So I'm going to spend a bit of time outlining what's been done in Wales to address these issues, and then ask if these actions are enough, and what we see as priorities really for the next Welsh Government to ensure that children can receive their right to food. So children's right to food should be fulfilled through one of two mechanisms, either through an adequate benefits and emergency support system that covers the cost of a healthy diet, or through sufficient family income secured through fair income from fair work. The reality is that Welsh Government and public bodies are facing a huge challenge, and I think it's very sobering today. The most recent child poverty figures are out showing that Wales has a nation with the highest levels of child poverty, and I know that Ellie will go on to expand on that a bit more, so I won't dwell on that now. But the other challenge is that, you know, health inequalities are rising rapidly as a result of poor diets relating to access, low incomes, and the food environment. And these are all issues that really have been exacerbated by COVID-19. Simon, you talked about what's adequacy. And I think this is really important in looking at the quality of diets. And this is one of the areas in which we see a cause of big health inequalities. We know that over a quarter of children in Wales are overweight or obese, and the prevalence of obesity in 4 and 5-year-olds is 7% higher in those living in the most deprived areas of Wales compared to those in the least deprived. So in Merthyr, over 20% of reception-age children are obese, and this is more than double that of local authority areas with the lowest prevalence. In terms of the quality of diets, we see that a third of adolescents in Wales reported eating just one portion of vegetables once a day, and that's against the Eat Well recommended of 3.5 portions. And inequalities, again, we see that the richest 20% of people across the UK are eating on average one more portion of veg a day compared to the poorest 20%. And we know that a fifth of children's vegetable intake in the UK now comes from ultra-processed foods which we know are associated with poor health outcomes. So why is this important? Well, it's important because the diets that are low in veg are associated with up to 8,500 premature deaths in the UK every year. It's important because being a healthy weight is protective against non-communicable diseases such as type 2 diabetes and heart disease. But also, we now understand it can also help us fight communicable disease. And, you know, evidence suggests that nations with over half the population at an unhealthy weight also had the poorest COVID-19 outcomes. In Wales, 60% of adults are an unhealthy weight. So whilst we have this challenge of overweight and obesity, we've also got this dual challenge of household food insecurity. So households with children are at an increased risk of food insecurity compared to those without. And food security basically means being sure of your ability to secure enough food of sufficient quality and quantity to allow you to stay healthy and participate in society. And it's a measure of severe material deprivation. Food Foundation data from last year, September, showed that around 12% of UK households with children experienced food insecurity in the previous 6 months. Between the 1st of April 2020 and the 31st of March 2021, food banks in the Trussell Trust's Wales network, and this is just one element of food banks in Wales, distributed over 145,000 emergency food parcels to people in crisis. Over 54,000 of these went to children. And we know that exposure to food insecurity is not equal across all households. Throughout the crisis, BAME communities have consistently encountered disproportionately higher levels of food insecurity compared with white ethnic groups. Adults with disabilities have also consistently been more acutely affected by food insecurity during the pandemic compared to those without disabilities. The data from Cardiff Council's Ask Cardiff survey found that 16% of adults reported that they'd eaten smaller meals or skipped meals as they could not afford food, and 18.7% of people who were disabled stated that they could not access food. And while we've come to know those working in the food sector during COVID as essential workers, they are also significantly more likely to be living in food insecurity than the general population. So what's being done to address these issues? Well, starting with school meals, we know from data, and I'm sure Ellie's going to expand on this, that over 70,000 children in Wales are not eligible for free school meals but are living in poverty, and these are pre-COVID figures. We know that Welsh Government have a breakfast scheme for primary school children, but this scheme has been severely compromised by COVID-19, and there are ongoing issues regarding ensuring that the children that most need the provision are the ones that receive it. A pilot is also underway to provide senior school pupils with an extra £1 on the free school meal allocation to cover breakfast in Year 7. Welsh Government were really quick to respond during the pandemic. They were the first of the UK nations to commit to extending free school meals in the holidays and have committed to do so until Easter 2022. In addition, they have committed £4.85 million to the delivery of the School Holiday Enrichment Programme over the summer. School Holiday Enrichment Programme is a school-based education programme that provides food and nutrition, education, physical activity, enrichment sessions and healthy meals to children during the summer holidays. The UK Government, and by default therefore Wales, has also increased the voucher value for the Healthy Start scheme. However, uptake of this scheme, which provides money for veg, fruit, pulses and other essentials to pregnant women and low-income families, is only around the 60% mark, which means 40% of eligible people aren't accessing that benefit. So driving up awareness of the scheme and extending eligibility is key moving forward. Welsh Government is due to consult on a strategy to improve the food environment as part of its obesity strategy, Healthy Weight, Healthy Wales, and this will also include a review of food in schools legislation. And one of the things that we're pushing for there is at the moment, primary school children only have one portion of veg in the school food standards, and we'd like to see that at 2 portions. So these are all really, really important steps to ensuring that children's right to nutrition, children's right to nutritious food is quite a mouthful, but is it enough? So I think, as I alluded to, more needs to happen to ensure every child in Wales receives their right to good food. Some of the mechanisms are at a UK level, and some of this will be covered off in the National Food Strategy, but many are within Welsh Government control. And we think that Welsh Government needs to seriously consider the following recommendations. So we think Welsh Government should use all possible levers to ensure that recommendations from the Fair Work Commission are enforced, such as deployment of the economic contract, to ensure that public funds only go to those employers who are supporting the living wage for Wales. Welsh Government should consider a range of options to create a Welsh safety net, adopting a cash-first approach. So under this, we could consider a review of eligibility for free school meals as part of a broader review of school food standards and procurement policies to ensure every child in Wales receives a nutritious, sustainably sourced school meal. Welsh Government actually has the least generous free school meal provision of all the nations, partly because it doesn't provide universal infant free school meals. Scottish Government has committed to universal provision of free school breakfast and lunches for all primary school children all year round, and they're also planning to pilot free school breakfast in secondary schools. The next thing is to continue to expand the school holiday enrichment programme across all holidays and geographically to support the recovery from the educational loss and increase in health inequalities caused by COVID-19. And continue to advocate the UK government for an increase in eligibility for Healthy Start vouchers. And finally, this might be something we could pick up in session later, but local authorities and public service boards should have responsibility under their socio-economic duty to ensure that all children receive their right to good food through measuring and monitoring food insecurity at a local level according to recognised standards. So many of these recommendations are included in the Children's Right to Food Charter, which puts forward a vision to tackle children's food insecurity and inequalities in childhood obesity, and it was the result of an inquiry led by the Food Foundation. Beth and Faith, as ambassadors for Wales, have helped create the charter, and I want to say a massive thank you to Beth and Faith, being supported with the Food Foundation for their hard work. But especially to Beth for her important contribution today, which I think you're about to hear next, Simon. So I'll pass back over to you.
Yeah, I got it wrong in the introduction. It is Beth next, Katie, you're quite right. While Eve is setting that up, just thank you to Katie for that, that presentation. Some really interesting points there. And I think some shocking information earlier on about the nutritional content or lack of nutritional content in children's diets, and some of the points you made on food insecurity and other aspects of food poverty are really quite shocking. A number of things I think discussed in the breakout rooms, including the place of free school meals in tackling food poverty in Wales. And you highlighted there, I think really interestingly, the role of public services boards. And the question I'm certainly going to be asking myself is what's going to be the impact of the socioeconomic duty in relation to poverty generally, but food poverty in particular. And as you say, something that maybe we can discuss in the breakout rooms in due course. Right, I think we're ready to go on the PowerPoint. It's a PowerPoint slide. What I would say is there's going to be moments of silence followed by Beth speaking. I'll introduce Beth in a moment. The moments of silence will be where Beth has prepared a slide with a question which she's posing to us rhetorically, but which then she's going to go on and reflect on in her short video presentations. So there'll be a moment of silence, about 15 seconds for us to read the question to ourselves, and then a video, then a bit more silence, question, then followed by a video, and a few of those. So just to introduce Beth, Beth Rhodes is a Welsh food ambassador. She says in her online bio that she has a passion for sports, including hockey, and badminton, and loves keeping fit and active, which possibly partly explains her interest in food and nutrition. She says she is passionate to change opinions, lives and attitudes across the UK towards food poverty and the food system. Eve, if we're ready, could we start the presentation, please?
Hi, my name's Beth. I live in North Wales and I've been a Food Foundation food ambassador for 3 years. Hi, my name's Beth. I live in regards to the policy, there's a few main areas that I think would be good to focus on. Firstly is the nutritional benefits of school food and how, even though it might be written down in legislation, how that passes on to food going into children's mouths. Second thing is how you can extend giving food in schools into holiday times, as we know that's a big issue. And third one could be increasing the amount of people that are on free school meals to make sure that no one's dripping off the edge of that curve, to make sure that everyone is getting the right food. In regards to the policy, there's it's really, really important to get them involved as much as we can. So this could firstly be done by contacting charities like the Food Foundation, because we are the people who are gathering all the information that we know to then write back to the government. Another way of doing this could be taking people who are not in these organisations, maybe through surveys, to get the general consensus of what is going on with school food. Another possible idea is going to maybe not so much charities, but organisations like the Youth Parliament, to get them to have their ideas and to ask people in their community. But I'd say the most important thing is to get young people involved as much as we can. So whether that's with meetings like I had with the First Minister, or in, well, even decisions locally. So for school food, for local councils, as long as young people are in there, their views are getting heard. So I went with the First Minister with another food ambassador when we went down to Cardiff. I think it was about last year, may have been. When we were there, we were discussing the Right to Food Charter and how it affects Wales. We were hoping that this sort of charter may influence the decisions that we're making now. But it's really, really important to get them. I believe that in the short term, the government should increase eligibility for free school meals. At the moment, when someone is on free school meals, there is a massive stigma, and there's lots and lots of studies, and even people in myself and people in schools can tell you that if someone is on free school meals, they are seen as different to everyone else, and you shouldn't be able to see income within students. We should all just be as equals. So if everyone were to have state funded school meals, then there wouldn't be this divide. And I feel as if, well, when you go to school, you have everything else provided for you. You're at the same level as everyone else, but it has to be different for meals when it shouldn't be. Especially during the times of COVID, the most important thing is to make sure that before look at the long term, look at short term, that there are thousands and thousands of children in Wales who are just missing out on free school meals that need to be there. And I believe that in the from COVID, I do believe that there has been an increased awareness of the issue of food, especially with children, but that's for it not for positive reasons, although it does have a positive outcome. With COVID, we all know that it's impacted everyone, but especially on food. And when there's been schemes that have failed and children not being able to get food, it's obviously brought media attention. And obviously, because we've been campaigning about this for 3 years, it's been good for our campaign. But we really need to strike while the iron's hot now. Everyone knows that food is an issue within our society and how people can't access it. But there's no point having all this attention for then nothing to happen. So what has affected my right to food is that I'm happy that there's lots and lots of more people aware of it. But now that we've got that backing, we need to do something about it. So from the COVID pandemic, we all know how much of an issue food has been for everyone, but it's not just individual cases that you hear on the news. Unfortunately, it is a vast majority of people, and it's come to the point where we've had to have celebrity campaigners to even inflict change within the government. What I would like to see is that the government recognises how much of a widespread issue it is and how their actions now can change people's lives. I'd like to thank you for inviting me here today, although I couldn't speak in person because I had school. But I'd just like to say that if anyone wants any more information, please refer to our charter. There's so much in there that goes way more in depth than I have today. And we think that that could really inflict some good and positive policy change.
Okay, well, that was really fascinating from Beth. Even though she's not here, I'd like to extend our thanks to her for those presentations, and we'll make sure that we message her in due course to thank her for making those videos for us to listen to. I think she raised some really interesting questions around how we go about increasing the availability of food, including how we use free school meals to do that, how we engage children and young people in action to tackle food poverty, and some really interesting points there, I think, on the impact of COVID-19. I'm ever trying to look on the bright side of things. There's hardly anything about COVID-19, which of course is a bright side, but one of the things to come out of COVID-19 is certainly a greater awareness of human rights issues, and as Beth picked up on there, on a greater awareness about the right to food. And she flagged up how we might think about how we use the momentum generated from COVID-19 to carry forward any work that we do on the right to food in due course. Okay, I don't want to say anything more about Beth's presentation, but I think Eve, we're popping the link to the food charter in the chat as well. If not, can we do that? What I'd like to do now is to introduce the next speaker, who is Ellie Harwood. Ellie joined the Child Poverty Action Group in 2019 as the lead for the UK Costa School Day programme across the country. Her team is currently conducting action research with thousands of children and young people in Wales, using a participatory children's rights approach to understand how poverty-related stigma is produced in educational settings. And of course, Beth touched on that a few moments ago in relation to the stigma that relates to free school meals. Alongside her research role, Ellie is also co-chair of the Wales Anti-Poverty Coalition, coordinating research, analysis and campaigns with a broad range of civil society organisations who are working together to eliminate poverty in Wales. So having given that introduction, over to you, Ellie.
Great. Thank you very much, Simon. And thank you, Katie, and thank you, Beth, as well. Just to sort of reflect on some of the points that Beth made there, it's really imperative that when we talk about food insecurity in childhood, when we talk about child poverty, that we understand stigma and the role that food insecurity can play in reproducing poverty-related stigma. So today I'm going to talk about some of the findings that myself and my team have from our work with children and young people in our project, The Cost of the School Day, which, as Simon mentioned, is an action research project that we're carrying out in schools. It's happening in England, Scotland and Wales. And we are in the process of speaking to thousands of children and young people about all aspects of life in school through the lens of poverty and low income. And there is a particular focus on children's experience of food and school meals and so on within that. So before I move on to talking about some of those findings, I think sometimes it's important when we're talking about something like child food poverty to slightly deconstruct the concept in order to really get to the kind of heart of like how we take action on these issues in a way that upholds children's rights. So I think sometimes you need to disentangle that concept slightly and recognise that there's child poverty and there's food insecurity. And attempts to address child poverty by tackling food insecurity alone will obviously not address child poverty in the whole. Food insecurity typically manifests as a result of poverty, but obviously there can be other factors as well. So sometimes solutions that address child poverty more broadly might not completely address food insecurity either, and some of the issues that Katie has mentioned around health and so on. Now, you know, my expertise is in child poverty and the kind of economic manifestation of that. But I think as we talk through now some of the examples that I'm going to give from our work, it's really helpful to kind of bear in mind. So as Katie mentioned, we've got new child poverty data for Wales that's been published today. And unfortunately, once again, Wales is the UK nation with the highest child poverty rate. So across the country, the average rate is 31%. It's almost 1 in 3 in many local authorities. And this is after housing costs have been taken into account. So a really significant proportion of children in our society are growing up in homes below the poverty line. And we measure poverty based on income alone. So it's how much money people have coming in once they've paid for their housing costs. And child poverty affects every aspect of a child's development. It limits their ability to develop to their fullest potential, and it impinges on their rights, you know, across the spectrum, not just their right to food, but pretty much every right, you know, that you can think of. It places them at a greater risk of dying in childhood. If they make it past childhood, it shortens their expected lifespan. It reduces the probability of them achieving good educational outcomes, and it leaves them at higher risk of experiencing adverse childhood experiences. And it's important to note that living in poverty does not necessarily mean experiencing material deprivation or food insecurity. And many children in poverty are well fed and they're well cared for and they're well clothed, often at the expense of the parents and carers. So I know that there's been research released by the Bevan Foundation, which found through the pandemic that it was parents and carers were experiencing much higher levels of cutting back on food than their children. Of course, there are many children who are experiencing household insecurity. As Katie has said, we know the number of food parcels that the Trussell Trust have been handing out. You know, once every 10 minutes, they have to give a food parcel to a child in Wales. And, you know, it's just unconscionable that that is happening. But poverty is harmful, even when the child is not experiencing material deprivation and food insecurity. And that's because poverty isn't just a disadvantaged and insecure economic condition, but it's also a shameful and corrosive social relation. So that is, it has a powerful psychosocial dimension which robs people of dignity, and it imposes stigma, and it requires considerable effort on the part of the person experiencing poverty to navigate that and to uphold their dignity in a world that treats them as being less than others. And of course, being in poverty and having to undertake that kind of negotiation reduces people's capacity for participation and authentic belonging within their communities. And unfortunately, sometimes schemes and systems that are designed to help people in poverty can inadvertently actually deepen stigma and social exclusion. And the example that we heard just then of free school meals and the way that being in receipt of something that's ostensibly intended to help children in poverty can actually produce stigma and leave them feeling worse off than their peers. And so, you know, this is one example of how understanding poverty as a psychosocial experience, as well as one of having fewer resources, is really important, particularly when you're talking to children. And the best way of understanding this is always to talk to children about their lives. And I give the example of my own life as someone who received free school meals all through my time in school. And when I went to school, I had to queue up every day in a special line to get a little pink laminated ticket every day that I could then go up and exchange in return for my dinner, along with all the other children who got free school meals. Now, in 21st century schools around Wales, most children don't have to do that anymore. Quite a lot of schools, they just use their finger. So they will have a biometric payment system, or there will be other ways of kind of very discreetly paying, perhaps with a card or something that everyone uses. And this kind of removes that immediate, obvious demonstration of who gets free school meals or who doesn't. And in fact, the Welsh Government, along with the Scottish Government, have regulations in place which say that it's actually not permissible to reveal who is in receipt of a free school meal and who isn't. But what we know from our research on cost of the school day is that actually it is still possible to know. And it's only by talking to, consulting with, listening to children and young people about their experiences of food in school that we can actually get into understanding what else is going on. So tens of thousands of children every day in Wales choose not to take their free school meal, even though they're in poverty, even though they're in need of that food, and even though they would benefit from eating that meal, they don't do it. And quite often research shows that they're doing that because of the stigma. Just as Beth mentioned, they will come up with strategies to avoid being identified as impoverished because of the stigma attached to that. And often the way that young people manage this is to self-exclude. So it's really important that policymakers and adults in schools understand, well, what is going on here, and work to design systems that mean that stigma isn't produced. So in the cost of the school day, our project, we carry out a process called poverty proofing, and we work with an organisation called Children North East, and our practitioners are trained as poverty proofers, and they go into schools and they'll speak to every person in the school, if possible, all of the children and young people, and they'll ask them a range of questions about their experience of life in school. And one of the questions will be something along the lines of, the government pays for some pupils to have a free school meal. Now, without naming names, is it possible to know who gets a free school meal in your school? So ostensibly, you would hope that the response to that would always be, it's impossible to know, I don't know. But actually, what we find is that there are ways that children, and they're often very aware, not just those in receipt, but also which of their peers are in receipt. So children who get free school meals can find themselves set apart from their peers if they're not able to choose from the same menu. So some schools will only serve hot meals to free school meal pupils, and they can't choose from other types of food on offer, the sort of grab and go options, sandwiches and so on. Some free school meal eligible pupils have to sit apart from their friends who bring packed lunches from home. So this can be a divide if they're only able to eat in certain areas. Some children face a limited choice because their allowance doesn't stretch to both a morning snack and a meal with a drink at lunchtime. Other children, there'll be much more expensive food options on the menu, but they have to kind of add up in their mind, I can only afford to buy this and this, and get to the till and make sure that what you've picked fits within the allowance for the day. And some secondary pupils say they feel embarrassed because they don't have personal spending money to buy snacks or to leave the school grounds and buy food from retailers like their friends do. So, these sort of experiences show us that for children and young people, navigating the stigma around receiving free school meals can be more difficult than simply disguising who is paying for the meal through the payment system itself. And if schools want to really poverty-proof their dinner halls, they need to consider the sort of social and relational aspects of food in schools as well. But this doesn't mean that it's difficult to do, and we found some examples of schools that do incredible things, really. And I'm just going to tell you about one school that I think has done an amazing job of destigmatizing the receipt of food in schools and ensuring better uptake. So in this school, children who are eligible for free school meals are allowed to spend their allowance throughout the school day on a full range of meals and snacks. So the children are empowered to make their own choices about what and when they eat. Any unspent money on the student's allowance is kept on their account so they can use it another day. So quite often what happens is that if the money isn't claimed, it just disappears into a black hole somewhere, and that's that money gone. But in this school, the money is kept on their account, it rolls over to the next day. On occasions where the parents or carers have been able to top up the student's allowance from home, then the school will make sure that they deduct the free school meal allowance first from the balance, so that the cost of the family is kept to a minimum and used as a last option. The catering manager in the school always ensures that there's cheaper options available so that pupils with less money to spend can still get enough and be included in what's on offer. And this ensures inclusion for children who don't qualify for free school meals but are still on a low income. And in Wales, more than half of children in poverty aren't eligible for free school meals because of our eligibility criteria. So it's really important that we make options available for those pupils who aren't getting any help with the cost as well. And then in the dinner hall, the children who are eating school dinners and the children who bring packed lunches are able to sit together, so that children who are having a free meal are able to eat with their friends. And the end result of all of this is that children feel included and they feel empowered. They are not left feeling embarrassed, ashamed, or left out. And I think that the important thing is that, when it comes to eating in school, the dignity comes from being able to consume the same food as your friends, paid for in the same way and eaten in the same space. So the sort of broader conclusions, I suppose, with the work here is that, we're pushing very hard to see more children included in free school meals, but we also need to make sure then that take up is high as well. And we need to listen to children and young people. We need to meaningfully consult with them about their experiences of food in school, and not necessarily be based on our own experiences of when we went to school, which unfortunately still does sort of come up quite a bit, because poverty is relative, and what poverty feels like changes over time. So to be a child in poverty in 2021 is not the same as being a child in poverty in 2010 or a child in poverty in the year 2000. Or, we need to continually understand that the nature of poverty in childhood is shifting, and we need to continually have that conversation with children and young people about what it feels like, not just measuring and counting how many children are poor and what they're going without, but what does it actually mean to live in our society as a child on a low income? That again, there are so many things that we can all do. I think within schools, it is very much about consultation and listening. And I think one of the wonderful things we've discovered through the cost of the school day work is just how important school caterers are, but the people who work in providing food in schools, in helping children cope with poverty, the extra steps that they go, the way that they know the children, the compassion that they show. And of course, I think the reason why so many people care about food and food poverty is because food is so symbolic for us as a way of showing care and love and community and connectedness to each other. And that extends to schools as well. So when we get it right, it's a really powerful way of ensuring inclusion, but it's just making sure that when we're designing systems and schemes that are intended to help children in poverty, that we don't deepen that stigma, and that we always give them the ability to make choices, to have dignity, and to have some autonomy as well. So thank you. That's kind of all I've got to say. I'm really looking forward to the discussions and the breakouts.
Thank you, Ellie. That was, I hesitate to use the word fascinating. I think in many ways, especially early on, some of what you said was actually quite depressing and difficult to accept. And there were some powerful insights there into the impact of poverty, stigma related to poverty, and to free school meals. I think for me, I have an interest in, obviously, children from a rights-based perspective. And what's perhaps doubly concerning for me is not just that we still have this situation in Wales, but that Wales is still the worst performing nation in the UK when it comes to child poverty. But Wales is the nation in the UK that has, to some extent, led the way on, ostensibly at least, embedding children's rights in policy and action, certainly at the ministerial level. So it's really concerning that we still have this situation decades now on from the outset of devolution, when children's rights were first prioritised in policy in Wales. It's obvious that we still have many, many challenges still to overcome when it comes to poverty in Wales and child poverty. Many of which I think we're going to be discussing in the breakout rooms, and that will include, I think you used a really nice phrase, Ellie, if you don't mind me saying, how do we go about poverty proofing our dinner halls, which I think was a really interesting question to be asked. And we can maybe pick it up in the breakout rooms, as well as the question that was posed by Dragon about what's going to be, or what's the likely impact going to be of universal basic income pilot in Wales on these issues. And